Okay, what is this? I'm afraid that's technically a swimsuit. Your eyes do not deceive you, and women used to bathe in that during the 19th century. But how on earth did we go from this to this? That is exactly what we are going to see today, and some major plot points in that story go from women's rights and their fight to be taken seriously as athletes to the atomic bomb or the Tradwife movement. We have a whole sea of weird facts to dive into, so let's go for it. Seeing this image, we would all agree that these girls depicted in a mosaic from the 4th century are, of course, wearing a bikini. But we would all be completely wrong about that assumption, because if these girls went swimming, they would go swimming naked. This is the kind of clothing that they would wear when practicing sports, but both men and women in the Roman times would go swimming without any kind of clothes. Greeks and Romans and many ancient civilizations would have a way less modest relationship with their bodies compared to the one that we have today. Part of that is because they had a correlation between beauty and virtue, so the naked body, when beautiful, was also seen as virtuous. And that's why we had a lot of ancient Greek sculptures of Greek gods and sometimes goddesses that are depicted completely naked. So there is no swimwear to speak of during centuries, and then in the Middle Ages, bathing in the sea wasn't seen as a pastime anymore, and actually bathing in the sea had kind of like a bad reputation in Europe for a while, so we have no specific kind of clothing that was used especially for swimming. But that slowly changed when people started enjoying the benefits of bathhouses. And around the 1700s, going to the seaside was seen as fashionable for the upper classes. So women wanted to bathe in the sea, but in the society of the time, going naked was absolutely out of the question. Also, people realized that any kind of fabric, when wet, would tend to reveal the body beneath, and of course that was also a scandal. So the solution for women's bathing suits was to wear a lot of fabric, quite thick if possible, and also trying to resemble more or less the usual dresses of the time. So imagine that you are a wealthy lady and you wanted to go to the beach. You would arrive at the beach and get changed into your fashionable bathing suit inside a bathing machine that was like a cabin on wheels that would bring you to the edge of the water, because God forbid anyone saw your ankles, and then you would go directly into the sea. Most bathing costumes for European women at the time were made of cotton or wool flannel and consisted of a pair of loose trousers or bloomers with a dress over them and some stockings to cover the visible parts of the leg, and to avoid the skirt to float into the water, they would attach small weights all around the hem of the skirt. Oh, and also you could wear a cape in case you felt underdressed somehow when you got out of the water. So it's actually a small wonder that women even wanted to go to the beach at all, and of course with all that fabric around you, swimming was completely out of the question. Probably you would paddle around with the grace and elegance of a very fashionable whale. Because of that, there were attempts to reduce the amount of fabric to get some more freedom of movement. So by the 1870s, we get bathing costumes with short sleeves and with shorter skirts or no skirts at all. In the 1880s, someone came up with the idea of combining the top and bottom garments to create a one-piece bathing suit with a skirt that could be detachable if you actually wanted to swim. By popular demand, there were also bathing corsets that were slightly shorter and lighter than the normal corsets of the time. So by the 1900s, women actually wanted to swim and not just paddle anymore, so they started asking for a more comfortable style of swimming costume that would allow them freedom of movement. Probably something like the knit garments that the men of the time were already wearing. The famous swimmer Annette Kellerman, also called the Australian Mermaid, visited the United States in 1910 and shocked everybody when she performed in her signature swimsuit, a tight-fitting one-piece garment inspired by men's gym wear. It was all very shocking and most women didn't take on this trend, but it made a difference for women who were started to take swimming seriously, especially the ones who wanted to compete as athletes. Because yes, despite having to wear the least practical clothes ever, some women did indeed like to play sports. In the second Olympic Games of the modern era in 1900, 12 women competed as athletes for the first time ever, and they did so in the categories of tennis and golf. However, this doesn't mean that they were accepted as proper athletes. For example, the first American woman who won a gold medal, instead of a medal, she got a porcelain bowl trimmed in gold. And even for several years afterwards, women who competed in the Olympics got diplomas instead of medals. But anyways, in the Olympic Games celebrated in Stockholm in 1912, women were allowed to compete for the first time in the swimming events. Most of the women who competed had the slightly scandalous approach to wear something more or less similar to what the men were already wearing at the time, and that was close-fitting knit garments made of cotton or wool that sometimes were slightly sheer. That's what the British team or the Australian team were wearing in these pictures. One of the Australian swimmers, Fanny Durack, had a great success during these games, and her style of swimsuit, which consisted of a hip-length tunic worn over some shorts, had a huge influence on the swimwear trends well into the 30s. For example, this is what women were wearing around the 1920s, and we can see that the swimsuits had much less fabric, but still women had to adhere to very strict rules about how much skin they could show above the knee. These swimsuits would still be made of cotton or wool knit, but finally in 1934 a new fiber called lastex was introduced, and it had an elastic rubber core that was covered with some other fiber like cotton or rayon. And this new fiber, lastex, allowed the swimsuits to fit much closer to the skin and weighed considerably less, which was particularly important for women athletes. However, even though these revolutions brought forward by women athletes then reflected into the swimsuits that were worn by the general population, the swimsuits were still pretty covering, especially compared to today's standards. So what happened in the next few years so that we started like this but ended up like that? Mainly two things. The first one was that tanning became fashionable. Coco Chanel is often credited with single-handedly making tan skin look cool when she accidentally burned herself while on vacation on the French Riviera. But actually, tanning had been steadily gaining popularity from the late 20s to the early 30s. The fashionable and wealthy had started going on vacation to the coast, so tan skin wasn't associated with poor people who had to work under the sun anymore, but instead with the rich and the powerful of the time who had the money to go on holidays. That's why Coco Chanel's tan wasn't that revolutionary in itself, but it was a way of confirming that tanning was indeed cool. So Coco Chanel in a way gave us her very stylish blessing to roast ourselves under the sun. So then, with tanning being all the rage, women started pulling down the straps of their swimming costumes, so a lot of swimwear brands started designing swimsuits with very thin straps, with low-cut backs or even strapless. But still, we are mostly talking about one-piece full swimsuits. There is still another historical event that would shape the swimwear industry forever, and that was the Second World War. During the Second World War, natural fibers and nylon, which was invented at this time and was started to be used in swimsuits, were used instead for war uniforms and parachutes. so they were shortages for consumer use. In the US, for example, the government demanded a 10% reduction in the fabric used for a swimsuit, so that fabric had to come from somewhere. While some designers experimented with removing fabric from the neckline or the back, the industry quickly realized that the easiest option was to remove it from the middle. And that's how we get all these two-pieces swimsuits that still were high-waisted and relatively covering. However, that was about to change in 1946 when a French engineer called Louis Réard invented the bikini. While visiting Saint-Tropez, he realized how the girls were rolling down the edges of the swimsuits from the tops and from the bottoms to get a better tan. So he came up with an idea that covered the bare minimum. Some weeks before that, a French designer called Jacques Heim had already presented a two-piece swimsuit that he called the Atom and was advertised as the smallest bathing suit ever created. But even the Atom seemed modest when compared to Réard's invention. He presented his bikini in a fashion event in Paris, but it was so revealing that he couldn't find a model who agreed to wear it. Not fazed by this turn of events, he instead hired the stripper Micheline Bernardini. He also revealed that he named his design after the Bikini Atoll, where the US had been experimenting with the atomic bomb, because he considered that the effect of his creation was explosive. So he not only invented the bikini, but also the worst dad joke in the history of fashion. Of course, the design caused a huge controversy, and even some countries like Italy and Spain banned the bikini to protect the decency of the young ladies that were going to the beach. Both Réard's and Heim's versions were a sales success, so maybe decency wasn't that high in the list of priorities of these young ladies. And by the way, for context, this is what men were wearing at the time. Now you cannot unsee that. Even though the backlash against the bikini lasted 40 years in fashion magazines, it became one of the most demanded styles, and by the 60s it was already commonplace. But of course, by the 60s, the whole attitude about showing skin had changed, in part thanks to a series of films featuring beautiful movie stars like Brigitte Bardot wearing the bikini. In 1964, the designer Rudy Gernwitz even presented his monokini, which sadly didn't become mainstream, but it's still a very interesting part of the swimwear history. And even in 1976, the female team of East Germany requested to compete naked during the Olympics. Their request was of course denied, but it would have been fun to see the Olympics come full circle to where the ancient Greeks were actually competing naked. Even so, this event shows how women have been fighting to gain agency in the way that they present themselves and challenging the traditional assumption that the female body is inherently a sexual object. So it looks like we kept removing fabric from our swimwear, and super tiny triangle bikinis became the norm rather than the exception in popular culture. In the early 2000s, there's even an article in the New York Times that calls the bikini the millennial power suit. And there is also another article, roughly from the same time, that complains that with the string bikini trend, designers have gotten consumers to pay more and more for less and less fabric. However, I did some research today and went to some online shops. And I discovered that super tiny triangle bikinis are not the most common styles anymore. Instead, I found myself with more options for more covering bikinis and even full swimsuits. Is this the end of the bikini? And if so, why? So, first of all, trends come and go, and it's completely normal that a period where showing as much skin as possible is the coolest thing ever might be followed by another period in which the trends are much less revealing. However, today we have a confluence of factors that I think is encouraging this attitude towards modesty. For much of the history of the Western world, we have seen that nudity has been equated with immodesty, even though that's not the case for a lot of other cultures. That reaction against nudity has a lot to do with the influence of religion in our culture. That's even more apparent when we are talking about the female body, which is traditionally associated with sexuality and sin. I have read a very interesting article that establishes a relationship with the rise of certain religious ideas in the US and its influence on the fashion trends. Even though it's an article from 2003, I think that a lot of what it says can also be applied today. It says that in a moment when the US is in a politically conservative period, those political and religious ideas get reflected into fashion trends and in how the body itself is perceived. The fact that we can see more modest swimwear from what we were used to a few years ago can be directly linked to more broader fashion trends for which the fact of showing more skin can be seen as trashy, immodest, or cheap. One of those trends, for example, could be the old money aesthetic that gained some traction recently, and it leans very definitely into seeing modesty as a way of looking rich, because apparently we now can perform wealthiness even though we buy our clothes from Shein. But even more than this, I believe that there's another trend that is having a more profound impact in the way that we perceive the female body and the implications of showing it or not. And that is the Tradwife movement. I'm not going to go into the specifics of this movement, but just in case you're one of the happy few that don't know what it is, Tradwife is shorthand for traditional wife, and the whole Tradwife culture is about going back to the traditionally feminine roles of staying at home, taking care of a couple dozen of children, and looking pretty for your husband, wearing feminine but modest outfits. I think this movement is having a broader influence than other aesthetic trends because it manages to bring together a lot of the cultural shifts that have been happening pretty much everywhere, but especially in the US, like the rise of conservative political ideas and a reaction against feminism and the woke. So, with Tradwife aesthetics influencing even major brands, we are getting more modest fashion, including swimsuits. Does this mean that we'll never see a string bikini ever again? Well, no, because in today's fashion industry we have hundreds of options, and no matter what we are looking for, we'll likely find some brand that is making that. So fear not, string bikinis exist today and will continue to do so in the future. Also, who knows what would be the new trend next summer? I, for one, will be happy as long as we don't go back to the wool swimsuits. And now tell me, what was your favorite swimsuit era? Would you wear one of those Victorian bathing suits? I have to admit that was a look. But let me know what you think in the comments if you're still watching at this point. And if you like this kind of deep dives, then this other video will be probably right for you. For now, have a lovely rest of your day and see you soon in the next video.